So here we are for my last part of the Iron Man Armored Adventures retrospective, finishing off Season 2, the second half, that is. Now, if you haven't seen any of this retrospective before, and you're brand new, I'll have the entire playlist linked down below in the description so that you can watch the entire thing in its entirety. And for those of you who are coming back to watch, thank you for coming back, and let's get it started. Let's just start by saying the second half of Season 2 is so much better than the first half. It is much more cohesive, and as well, it is just so amazing. This second half of this season has some of my favorite episodes, and the second half even starts off pretty hot, with this entire first episode being focused around Tony Stark and dealing with his issues around what happened to Stane, along with repairing some of the issues he had with Whitney Stane, because the two have been driven even further apart due to the fact that Obadiah is now permanently in a coma. And to make everything worse, Tony's arch nemesis, Gene Khan, comes back looking for his help. Not only does Gene come back to torment him about the fact that his dad may or may not be dead and may or may not be kidnapped, he also is in desperate need of Tony's help. And how does Gene decide to go about this? It's very simple. He uses the Makluan ring to trick Tony into thinking they're once again friends and basically brainwashing him. Because that's exactly what you do to old friends, isn't it? Now, Gene has definitely been interestingly out of the spotlight for the last half of this season. We've really only had a few episodes going back and looking at Gene as a character, with not a whole lot of spotlight on him outside of being sometimes a B-plot in episodes. And it's really good to see him be the A-plot of an episode again. Now, I recognize why they made him the B-plot. He had to go out and find more Makluan rings, but it is nice just to have him back on the A-plot, mainly because I like the dichotomy between him and Tony, especially now that they're not on the same side of things anymore. And as for the rest of the plot of this episode, it's fairly simple. It's just setting up the fact that Gene is continuing to get more and more Makluan rings, and as well that there are more guardians and trials for the group to overcome. Although this might be one of my favorite guardians of the Makluan rings, simply because he is forcing each character to relive a traumatic portion of their past, and basically leave them powerless unless they have the willpower themselves to move forward. Each one of these Makluan rings is symbolic and represents something that we'll get to much later in this overview of the second season. But it is nice getting to do a little bit of a peer-in both on Gene and on Tony to see what their greatest fears at this moment are, with Tony's being that Obadiah not only takes over Stark International, is out of his coma, but as well ends up turning his Iron Man armor and Ironmonger armor into a sort of police force. We also see a heavy emphasis on Pepper and her care for Gene. Even though Gene betrayed them, she still believes that there is the best in Gene and that he will do the right thing, even convincing Tony to go help Gene in order to get him out of his mind-melded state so that they can take care of the Makluan Guardian, which unfortunately leads to Gene collecting the 8th Makluan ring. Hence meaning that dude is just getting more and more powerful. And that's kind of where this episode ends. And honestly, it doesn't really get much better for Tony in the coming episodes. And it just seems to really get worse and worse, simply because Hammer Multinational, yes, Justin Hammer, bought out Stark International and is now owning the entire company. Simply because Stane is off the books, the board needed someone to pick up the bill for the company after the massive disaster that was Ironmonger and Stane's rampage. I like to see that in this season we see a lot more consequence, especially in this second half, from events that happened at the beginning of the season. Oh, and another consequence of this is now Tony is completely flat broke. His entire trust fund has now been liquidated by Hammer Multinational,
under the company name, which Mr. Hammer now owns. You're penniless, Mr. Stark.
Roberta, is that possible?
But Tony, by this point, as we all should know, isn't exactly one to give up on a fight, so he taps into Justin Hammer's intel and sees that he might be having a fraudulent shipment of weapons, except that was all completely fabricated by Justin Hammer so that he can take down Iron Man once and for all using his newly refurbished titanium man armor, which has just been like so non-threatening this entire show. I mean, that suit got dogged on constantly, but it was really cool though, and I really do like this show's version of Justin Hammer. Regardless, we do get another subplot of Tony's been kidnapped and the gang have to figure out a way to save him, which I felt like was done way better in the first season because Rhodey wasn't War Machine and Pepper wasn't as proficient at using the Iron Man armor as she is currently via remote mode. But that's what made this episode important. It establishes that Pepper is starting to get practice with using an Iron Man armor, as well as establishing that Tony is officially broke by this point, and there should be some more weight behind it when his armors get damaged and or destroyed. As well, they once again dog on Justin Hammer, because that's just how it is. But the real most important part of this episode is the beginning of a brand new tech startup that Tony has decided to develop so he can continue funding being Iron Man. That being Stark Solutions, a company focused on helping people build towards a better future, something Tony firmly believes in.
Stark International. But for now, today marks the first day of our new enterprise, called...
Oh! Circuits Maximus!
What? It's catchy.
Well, I was thinking something a little simpler, like Stark Solutions.
Another part of the reason why I really like this second half of the Iron Man Armored Adventure show is it does a lot to change up the status quo of the show. And this really starts with the episode Extremist. Now, we definitely saw some status quo changes last episode, but this one will change up a lot of things. Now, if you guys are Iron Man fans, which if you've clicked on this video, I'm gonna say you might be, right? I could assume a fair portion of you might like Iron Man. Then you know what the Extremist storyline entails, and honestly, I was very surprised that this show chose to adapt it, just considering how dark the story is in general. But it is one of my favorite Iron Man stories, and as well I think they do a really good job of developing it, even though it was only a one episode thing. In a basic sort of way, I just want to cover Extremist real quick. The entire idea behind this is this dude takes a derivative, at least in this show, of the super soldier serum that Captain America had taken. And unfortunately, this turned him into a literal freak of nature who is extremely strong, extremely powerful, and is able to suck the life force out of things and people. And of course, when Tony saw him on the street fighting, he does try and get involved in order to take him out. Unfortunately, Tony ends up severely damaged and gets his arc reactor severely damaged. Now, this episode takes a lot of liberties from the real Extremist comic, but I think it does so in a decent manner, and I do very much enjoy it. This episode also decides to finally reveal to S.H.I.E.L.D. who Iron Man is. S.H.I.E.L.D. now knows that Tony is Iron Man. As well, we get to see Black Widow more in a heroic role than we did earlier in this season. My apologies. Regardless, Tony is now completely incapacitated. As a matter of fact, he is told he'll never be Iron Man again due to the sheer amount of damage to his heart implant. And of course, Tony doesn't want to believe this at all. So he wants to try and take Extremist for himself in order to continue to be Iron Man, because he believes he can essentially get the dosage right so he doesn't turn into a vampiric monster. We also get a really cool reference to Captain America, which I personally love, because this show's world building was just fantastic.
It could turn you into a monster.
You're out of your skull, son. We're still in testing phases.
Did you see what Malin did to me out there? He's gonna do the same to you, to everyone.
Now, of course, Tony being Tony, he very much ignores Nick Fury's, well, any sort of warning anybody was giving him. Pepper, Rhodey, Nick Fury, Maria Hill, pretty much everybody, and decides to instead take the virus for himself and transform himself with the hopes that he will become better. Now, I personally really like status quo changes, especially in long-running shows. Sorry about that. And Tony does have a pretty decent one. He no longer needs to charge his implant. He no longer has to have an implant. Tony is now on a neurological level connected to technology, i.e. his suit can come to him at any time. He can map into technology whenever he wants to. Tony is, for all intents and purposes, superhuman at this point. He's no longer just a regular person. And it is in this episode that Tony finally, after 2 long seasons, earns the respect of Nick Fury, to the point Nick Fury even invites Tony to be a part of a team he's putting together. Spoiler alert, that's the Avengers, but oddly enough, they're never fully formed and or referenced in this show. Regardless, I think you guys know the rest. Tony obviously beats the man who took Extremist first, and he ends up going on about his time as Iron Man.
I'm putting together.
Thanks, Fury. But I'm not much of a team player.
Well, whatever you plan to do, son, just remember, S.H.I.E.L.D. could always use you.
Thanks, General Fury. I'm not sure what the future holds, but, you know, I'm okay with that.
Now, by this point in the video, you guys are probably noticing that this is fairly different from my usual style of content, in which I am far more analytical and much more willing to try and dissect these characters in these shows. And I'll be honest with you guys, there's almost nothing left to dissect. They haven't really, as characters, changed much from the first season. Sure, Gene Khan as a character, I'll have a little bit more dissection on him, but that's more towards the end of this video rather than the beginning or the middle. Instead, I'm going to treat this more as a retrospective in which I can highlight one of my favorite TV shows from when I was a kid, and that's kind of how I'm just going to go. So I'm pretty much going to cover every episode, and hopefully you guys continue to enjoy this. If not, that's completely fine, as it's not atypical of my usual content. But this next episode of Iron Man Armored Adventures is my favorite. I don't know if I've said that before, hopefully not, because this is quite literally my favorite episode, and can you guess why? It involves the X-Men, one of my favorite, or I take that back, my favorite Marvel group ever. This entire episode's themes are about discrimination, the discrimination specifically that mutants face on a day-to-day basis. And of course, as per usual, this is an allegory for the discrimination we see in our everyday lives, whether that be of black people, of women, or of just about anyone. The X-Men sort of fit that role in its entirety. And this episode does a really good job at trying to highlight this without saying that it's about real life events and just using the term mutant, and it's kind of just a wink and nod as to you know what. And I also find it very interesting that Rhodey is the #1 character to defend Jean Grey. Yes, the brand new student who has showed up at Iron Man's high school, that being Jean Grey, going under a different alias, and Rhodey finds her very attractive.
Whoa, she's cute. Am I right or am I right?
He like the snobby stuck-up better than thou attitude.
Nah, I think she's just shy.
We are shown throughout this episode that mutants are definitely not treated very well, almost at all, especially in this universe. They're fairly new, considering the fact that Jean isn't at Xavier's school yet, and Magneto is fairly unknown, so mutants are very much ostracized. Now, what's very interesting, as I pointed out earlier, is Rhodey is very sympathetic to mutants and how they are treated. Now, part of me wants this to be because, you know, he knows what it's like to be othered as being a black teenager, but, you know, it could also very much as well be the fact that he thinks Jean is hot, and that could be motivation enough, and I might just be reading too deeply into it.
We saw everything. You're one of them, aren't you? A mutant?
And that freaks you out?
No, of course not.
And it's also worth noting that Pepper has to kind of play the other side of the coin, i.e. the very reluctant and almost scared citizen who has to try and understand what it's like dealing with mutants. Now, Pepper, I don't know, it felt slightly out of character that she would try to other someone for being a mutant and for being different, considering she knows Iron Man and a bunch of other superpowered heroes and villains. But again, that might just be a problem with Marvel in general, being that mutants are really persecuted and no other superheroes aren't, but that's a topic for another day. But I simply bring this up because when Jean does end up getting captured once again by Magneto, who is desperately trying to get her to kill Bolivar Trask, one of the US's senators, Pepper kind of makes the point of saying, let's just leave Jean and let mutants deal with mutant issues. Does that sound familiar?
You know, this isn't really your fight, Tony. It's between the mutants.
There you go again. Talking about mutants like they're so different from us. We're all people.
I know that. I'm just saying. We're still interfering.
Now, for the intents and purposes of keeping this section at a decent length, because I had written way too much, as I realize now. Basically, Jean ends up going along with Magneto's plot, at least for a little bit, simply because she is kidnapped by him and he's threatening to kill her. At least until Team Iron Man shows up and they are able to help Jean, as Jean goes out of her way to actually try and save the senator, who pretty much wants her dead. And in the end of obviously Team Iron Man's able to beat Magneto and as well embarrass Trask on national television after he claims that he still wants Jean locked up despite the fact that she saved his life. A fairly cheesy scene, but a very cathartic one at the end. And that's kind of this episode. It's my personal favorite because I'm very X-Men biased, I'll just be honest. Oh, and Pepper learns her lesson too.
Unless someone really ticks me off. You guys trusted me. Now I want to trust something to you. My real name.
It's not Annie?
No, it's Jean. Jean Grey.
I like that even more than Annie.
We also get another nice bit of world building, which is we're introduced to Professor Xavier in this universe, and it's the first and last time we'll ever see him. Now, for the sake of my own sanity, as well as keeping this video moving in a coherent fashion, these next few episodes that I'm going to cover are going to be more in a rapid-fire sense, and more along the lines of just being filler, that even though they are filler episodes, are absolutely amazing and tie up some loose ends that really need tied up. For example, this episode currently that you're seeing is all about the controller and how he has essentially trapped Tony within a complete social network, as he calls it, that he can control fully. Basically, it's a Matrix episode, and it's extremely cool, but it has really little to no bearing on the overarching story. It's a filler episode essentially, but a really good filler episode because it finally ties up the loose end of what's going on with the controller. As well, we get some really cool bits of Tony just being by himself for an episode where Rhodey and Pepper really aren't there as much as supporting characters. And this episode in particular ends up with the controller being completely and utterly mind-wiped. Because of the device he used on his head getting overloaded, he doesn't really remember anything at all anymore, which is definitely a nice way to tie up the character, as he's had 3 separate episodes featuring him at this point. Oh, and we get a nice tease at the end of the episode that is probably never going to be followed up on, considering this show has been over for the better part of like a decade at this point. But the show does a lot of these endings that confused me as a kid and still kind of confuse me to this day, and I just don't know why they did it. The next episode is all about Iron Man 2099. Essentially, in the year 2099, a virus that Tony Stark created earlier in the timeline has pretty much caused the utter collapse of the entire world, along with most of their military. So the world's basically gone to shit because of one of Tony's inventions, and his great-great-grandson has come back in time sporting a really cool version of the Iron Man armor, might I add. Really fit the aesthetic of the show too. Basically, he came back in time to stop Tony from being able to create the virus, and so he was just going to straight up kill Tony, which is hilarious because he's a descendant of Tony, but he does recognize that. As well, a nice little tidbit this episode throws out is that because of all the chaos, Justin Hammer ends up president of the United States for a 3rd consecutive term, which is absolutely insane, because if you've seen this show, you know how just unhinged Justin Hammer is, and it's kind of hilarious to think he becomes president. Or is it really that crazy, all things considered? And in a pretty good twist, ironically enough, Tony's descendant coming back in time to try and kill Tony in a paradoxical way ended up causing the virus to be made and be distributed for the very first time. Now, obviously, he doesn't realize this until it's already too late, but by the time he does go back in time and decides to fix the issue, his life is effectively over, or at least this version of him is erased from the timeline. And honestly, it was a damn good episode. It just isn't really that important in the grand scheme of the show and the rest of season 2, other than just being a good episode, which is just something the second half of season 2 is full of. Oh, and Justin Hammer doesn't become president anymore. Instead, he goes to jail, where he belongs. Again, I'm seeing a parallel here, but I just can't put my finger on it. And now we're back to far more plot significant episodes. That's what I'm gonna call these next few, which obviously start off with another episode about Jean Khan and the Makluan rings. At this point, Jean has 8 of the rings and is desperately looking to get his 9th ring, which happens to be in Latveria, aka where Doom resides. Yes, Dr. Doom is coming back. And while Jean is off doing that, it is also worth noting that Pepper is, for the very first time, practicing in the Iron Man stealth armor herself, not simply remote piloting it. And she's not doing the best job, let's be honest. She's a rookie. Regardless, Jean shows up at Tony's doorstep extremely desperate and devoid of a majority of his powers, as Doom has just absolutely cooked him. And the only reason Tony even bothers in deciding to help Jean and getting this next ring back is because he finds out his father is genuinely alive and being held hostage by Dr. Doom.
Sick of your...
Turn that thing off, Gene. You're starting to irritate me.
Dad? You monster!
So, reluctantly, Tony decides to team up with the Mandarin, aka Jean, and just kind of slowly feed him rings one by one, giving him just enough power to help Tony out, but hopefully not overwhelm him. While that's happening, Rhodey and Pepper have to deal with the fact that Dr. Doom is opening portals to dimensions beyond our comprehension in order to bring out demons and monsters that will essentially take over all of the world, because Doom is just so unabashedly evil in this show for no reason, and in general. Now, Tony's quest to find Jean and his father, along with Dr. Doom, doesn't really end the way he planned. He ends up getting captured in the same cell that his father's in, but at least Tony knows that his dad's alive at this point, even if Dr. Doom is continuing to experiment with Makluan energy and is releasing horrifying looking demons that scared the ever-living shit out of me as a child. And unfortunately, the only way for them to get out of their prison and to be able to try and defeat Dr. Doom is for Jean Khan to get all 9 of his Makluan rings, leaving the back door and potential to get his 10th. Have I mentioned how amazing the Mandarin suit looks in this show yet? Like, I keep getting comments about it, and it's gotta be one of the top 5 designs in this show, and it's not even an Iron Man armor. Regardless, Tony does end up escaping as well as defeating Dr. Doom, but in the process, Jean has also made his way into getting his 9th Makluan ring, this being he's one more off basically. But on the flip side, Tony at least gets his father back, and I think that's a really big thing for him, especially because Tony is absolutely ecstatic.
I'm just glad to have you back, Dad.
Today we celebrate, and tomorrow we take back Stark International.
Now, this next episode is very important because it's going to be the culmination of Justin Hammer as a character. We've seen him throughout the start of Season 2, all the way up until this 21st episode of Season 2, and we've seen how he slowly started to just lose it completely. Especially when it comes out that Justin Hammer is being blackmailed. He starts going after a majority of Tony Stark's ex-villains. So we're actually going to see a huge drop-off in the amount of villains this show has. There are a multitude of them that are already dead, and a few that will be dying. But at the same time, we also have to deal with the conflict of Tony and his father trying to get Stark International back from Hammer Multinational.
Instant! Count Nefaria.
Admit it! You're the one! It's you blackmailing me!
Blackmailing you? Between Iron Man's crime fighting and you taking the mafia business, I'm ruined!
We also get to see just how Hammer is taking out each and every person he believes is blackmailing him, and it's honestly kind of hilarious and very in character for Justin Hammer, which is that he's turning them all into zombies, because what could be more ludicrous and over the top than coming up with a way to turn people into the living walking dead? Because why not? Justin Hammer is just so mentally sick. I kind of love it. Like, as a villain, he's great. But this also just kind of spells the end for a lot of Tony's rogues gallery, whether it be Whiplash, Mr. Fix, Killer Shrike, and Unicorn. They're all pretty much going to be wiped off the map by Justin Hammer and his paranoia. It is fairly unfortunate because these have been recurring characters since the first season, they've been great to watch, but the show itself is starting to come to an end, and it's kind of fitting that they all get end goals. As well, Tony continues to get lessons in his own personal life from his father about the value of doing things by the book and by the law. We also see his father sort of disapproves of Iron Man.
But causes as much destruction as the people he fights.
But it's worth it, right? I mean, he saves lives.
That's what the police are for. Iron Man's an amateur, he's reckless, and someday he's gonna get hurt.
It is also worth noting that Tony hasn't told his father that he's Iron Man yet, but it is very much heavily implied that Howard knows anyways, whether Tony is going to tell him or not. Now, the rest of this episode is essentially just Tony and Rhodey trying to figure out a way to stop Justin Hammer from killing a bunch of Iron Man's villains, as well as try and stop him from enacting an even crazier plan, which is to turn the entirety of New York into zombies, because Justin Hammer is extremely paranoid and absolutely insane. And dude loses it even more when he is finally fully and completely outed as the terrible person he is. And ironically enough, the person that has been blackmailing him and doing all of these things to him has been Mr. Fix, who has been desperately trying to get revenge ever since Justin Hammer took away his physical body and made him into nothing more than a program.
Revenge for taking my body and turning me into a digital freak.
And of course, Justin Hammer gets his comeuppance in one of the most poetic ways possible, that being Mr. Fix finally getting his full revenge on Justin Hammer, turning Justin Hammer into a zombie, much like he's done to a lot of Iron Man's rogues galleries throughout this episode. And as well, Tony effectively kills Mr. Fix. Is it killing because Mr. Fix's consciousness was still there, but his physical body was gone, so is it really just a construct of his mind? That's a topic for another day, and probably a philosopher. Regardless, Tony's villains are pretty much eradicated. A majority of the rogues gallery he spent fighting is gone, but with Hammer being out of the picture, conveniently, Tony Stark and Howard Stark are both now back in control of Stark Internationals and are going to merge it with Stark Solutions, which is how Tony has been able to afford all of his armor and everything by selling off more inventions. Throughout the last few episodes, he hasn't had his trust fund. And the next episode, which you guys are probably going to be surprised isn't one of my favorites, is all about the Hulk. Yes, that's right. You guys are going to get to hear me talk about, God, we're coming up on 10 times I've talked about the Hulk now. Regardless, I'm going to keep this very brief because the episode doesn't hold a lot of weight other than setting up a small change in Hulk as a person. We're introduced to the fact that Hulk and, well, Bruce Banner and Howard Stark were very close friends and colleagues back in the day, before Banner's transformation. And so Banner comes to Howard Stark, now seeing that Howard is alive, and wants to ask for his help in hopefully being able to reverse his change into the Hulk, using a form of gamma radiation technology, all in the hopes that it would reverse his being the Hulk. It's also notable that Rick is basically completely absent from this episode outside of the flashback that Hulk decides to describe. I keep using Hulk and Bruce Banner interchangeably. I really shouldn't. It's Banner. Regardless, the entire experiment goes awry when not only does S.H.I.E.L.D. show up, but so does everyone's favorite military general, General Ross, who is effectively ranked above Nick Fury and is able to order Nick Fury around. I never thought I'd see the day, but here we are. And so essentially he's ordering Nick Fury to go after Hulk and to continue to pursue him regardless of the casualties and or faults. General Ross is pretty much hell-bent on destroying the Hulk by any means necessary, even if it means putting a bunch of S.H.I.E.L.D. personnel at risk, something we see that Nick Fury has absolutely zero interest in, nor does it seem like Nick Fury wants to entertain this guy in the slightest. And so, of course, when Hulk ends up captured and is being held hostage at S.H.I.E.L.D. and by General Ross, Iron Man decides to devise a plan not only to get Hulk out, but hopefully get him to a state in which he can help Hulk get back to being Bruce Banner and have Bruce Banner perform the gamma irradiated, I'm just going to call it surgery, to hopefully transform him back into nothing more than Bruce Banner. Yeah, no, that plan goes horribly, and Hulk is pretty much raging all throughout New York City streets, and Iron Man is trying to gently coerce him into going off and getting on the Gamma platform. And when Hulk does end up on the Gamma platform, General Ross, instead of sapping the Gamma away from Hulk, decides to overload him with Gamma, and in the process, he's going to level the entirety of New York just so he can potentially kill the Hulk. And Iron Man is desperately trying to stop this because, well, this would level New York and kill a lot of people. Now, it is worth noting that we get a pretty cool scene from Hulk where he calls Iron Man his friend and saves him, and Hulk essentially takes the Gamma irradiated blast himself, but he comes out different. Not Hulk, not Banner, but gray.
I would like nothing more than to squash you, General.
Someone help me! Please! No!
And as you can see there, highly intelligent. It's actually really cool to see that we're getting more than just one variant of Hulk, even if Gray technically came first. Again, this show's world building when it came to Marvel characters, it truly made me feel like the people behind this show loved Marvel, not just wanting to make this show a quick cash grab. Oh, and General Ross gets arrested. And Howard makes more sly remarks, essentially telling Tony and Rhodey that he knows they're both Iron Man and War Machine. The episode, very much following that one, is all about tying up one of the loose ends left, because if you've been paying attention, this show pretty much has 4 episodes left. So this one is all about tying up loose ends in a filler sort of way. Obadiah Stane meant a lot to Howard Stark at one point in their professional business lives, and Howard wants to help Obadiah as best as he can by any means necessary, even if Tony doesn't fully understand it. Now, when Obadiah is going to be visited by Howard Stark, dude is just completely missing. He's supposed to be completely comatose and just non-verbal in general, but he's out and about walking around as though nothing is wrong. Now, I'm just gonna rip the band-aid off. Spoiler alert, Obadiah's still in a coma, and it's all been a plot by Madame Masque, aka Whitney Stane, to essentially get revenge not only on Tony, but on Howard Stark as well. Whitney essentially gets one of Obadiah's old bodyguard men, who still works for Stark International for whatever reason, to hopefully inject Howard Stark with poison, that being O'Brien. O'Brien's such a douche, man, I swear. And then Tony is told that he must come alone to a warehouse in order to save his father and get the antidote that his dad needs, or he'll basically die.
Happy?
My best friend's in trouble. His dad has 2 hours left to live, and I'm stuck on the sidelines completely useless. I'm the happiest guy on Earth.
Hey, sarcasm's my thing, not yours.
Now this, of course, for once leaves Rhodey sidelined since the first season. He's really been an active participant. And so him and Pepper, feeling unfortunate about being sidelined, decide to try and press Whitney for information, and it goes about as well as you can imagine. It goes terribly. Now, when Tony does arrive to try and receive the antidote, it doesn't work out at all. As a matter of fact, he is almost gunned down to death, and Whitney is just extremely vindictive by this point. She just truly wants to see Tony hurting and in a lot of pain. He even gets Ironmonger out and parades it as though her dad is in the suit once again, knowing how much it will mess with Tony's head. As well, she nearly gets Rhodey and Pepper blown up in the Iron Man armory, simply because she does now once again remember that Tony is Iron Man. But what's really tragic about this memory coming back is she doesn't remember any time previous to that still. She doesn't remember what it was like when the two of them were close and dating for the first time, when she was Madame Masque for the first time, why she even became Madame Masque in the first place. It's honestly fairly tragic. Almost reminds me of Wanda from X-Men Evolution and how she felt to her dad previously before getting brainwashed. I wonder if they kind of riffed off of that for this updated version of Madame Masque. Regardless, she goes on a long monologue and basically tells Tony how she's been messing with him this entire time.
Playing you like a game. And this is game over.
I'm sorry, Whitney. The last thing I wanted was for any of this to hurt you.
But thankfully, at the end of the day, Tony finally stops pulling his punches. He stops treating Madame Masque like Selena Kyle and starts treating her more like Harley Quinn, if that analogy makes sense. He just kind of stops caring and is finally willing to turn her in, especially after the things that she has done consecutively and the people she is threatening to hurt at this point in Tony's life. Now, Tony is able to save his father, but it does also open his eyes and make him realize a few things. That even if his dad is alive, he still doesn't know he's Iron Man. And Tony is thinking that at this point, by how many villains know, by the fact that S.H.I.E.L.D. knows, that eventually he'll have to tell his dad before somebody else does, or something even worse happens to him. Because part of this is on Tony for the life that he lives, and his dad does at least deserve to know what's going on.
I have to tell my dad before someone else does. Before more people get hurt.
And we get another tease that'll never be followed up on. But I like to imagine that these are like the teases at the end of comic books, in which you're just assumed that the world continued to go on post the show being over. Regardless, we're in the end game now. These last 3 episodes of the show all directly tie into each other and are very important. They're also very Jean-centric, and that means I get to actually do some breakdown and analysis. Throughout the first season and second season, we've got to see a lot of Jean's past, a lot of the ways his mother has spoke about him being the Mandarin, about him protecting the world, taking care of it, and genuinely being a decent person seems quite lost on Jean in his almost evil want for power. He doesn't really seem to care about being much of a protector anymore at that point. Now, I do want to take a little bit of an aside just to mention a few things about this episode. This is going to be where the 10th Makluan ring is found. As well, this is the episode that Pepper finally gets her own costume. Iron Man suit, my bad. Yeah, it took this long for her to finally get her rescue suit, but damn does it look good. Regardless, I want to focus majority of these last few episodes, analysis-wise, on Jean. Now, getting back to Jean, when we do catch up with him, he has made it to the final guardian of the Makluan rings, who we happen to find out is a group of sentient lizard beings, yes, lizards live among us, that happen to be the original bearers of the Makluan rings. We actually get a decent lore dump about the past of them, as well as hearing how just unworthy Jean is, and how similar to the original Makluan ruler Jean is acting. The original man to hold the 10 Makluan rings, or lizard in this case, only really cared about world domination and cruelty. He cared about expanding his reach in the galaxy far and wide, and about conquering, almost in a Genghis Khan style way. It took a brave man who was willing to smuggle the rings away from the man who would rule them all, and he took them to Earth, hoping to continually breed down a line of successful holders of the Makluan rings. It also explains why Jean is the only person who can truly harness its power outside of Dr. Doom, and even then he couldn't tap into it fully, because he is of Makluan descent. Yes, somebody piped down a lizard, and I am genuinely concerned about the ramifications that had on my brain as a child. And to make things even funnier, Pepper is actually deemed the most worthy out of anybody in that room to gold the Makluan rings.
That Jean can't wield the rings.
Thanks, sir, but I'm just fine without any alien DNA. No offense.
None taken, as I was not referring to you, but to the female human.
Ha! See? Not everything's about the oh-so-wonderful Tony Stark. Wait, what? Me?
Now, in basically no surprising fashion, Jean is able to achieve all 10 Makluan rings and gain unlimited power. It's also worth noting that he almost straight up refuses to fight Pepper. He doesn't really want to hurt her, at least until she strikes first. I think that's because they had a fairly close relationship to each other earlier on in the show. Now, Jean himself, upon retrieving all 10 of the rings, is ultimate power. He has everything he has ever wanted and dreamed for. He is now, in all intents and purposes, omniscient. He can see everything, and yet he still wants more. And he wants to not only take control of the world, but get revenge on the people that hurt him, i.e. Iron Man and Rhodey. He still wants to harm them. Jean never really grew up from being a petulant child who simply wanted power. He never grew past the trauma of losing his mother and having to deal with his abusive stepfather, Jong. And honestly, the person who points this out to him is Howard Stark, because despite all of the grievances Howard has with him, he still has slight empathy for Jean.
Strike me down. You're no great hero, no destined king. You're a power-hungry child who would gladly squash whoever stands in his way.
Lies!
This gives enough pause for Team Iron Man to escape, at least, but it also is starting to give Jean a bit of self-reflection in his own right. Basically, Jean has to be confronted with the fact that he's not the hero he believes himself to be, because Jean thinks of himself as the hero in this situation. And that leads us directly into the two-parter finale. Man, I really am a sucker for two-part finales. I just think they're such great ways to end shows, because trying to squeeze a finale into one 23-minute segment never truly works. Regardless, Jean starts off the episode by laying claim to the entirety of the world, claiming to be the world's protectors and asking everyone to bow to him, as he is the rightful ruler of the universe. And he basically threatens that anybody who stands in his way will be quashed and squashed, and that no resistance will exist. Now, of course, that doesn't sit right with Team Iron Man at all, nor does it really sit right with S.H.I.E.L.D. and/or any of the other superheroes we've encountered throughout this entire show's run. But not a whole lot of that ends up mattering, because Jean ends up being captured by the original holder of the 10 rings of Makluan. Essentially, Jean is being confronted with the man who held power so long ago and who wants his power back as the Mandarin, and the dude's able to take it almost effortlessly from Jean, making him look like he is nothing in comparison despite having all 10 rings. As well, we get another lore exposition dump that is really nice to finally hear as we uncover the mystery of the Makluan rings.
Having conquered half of the cosmos, we prepared a great feast, but I was betrayed by a weakling who stole the rings and fled.
I think Jean sort of starts to see a parallel between himself and where he's going, and with this madman ruler who has been essentially taking over and conquering galaxies. Jean is slowly but surely moving his way closer to being far more like that than any sort of hero that he believes himself to be. Now, just for some general episode, and so you don't feel too lost, Team Iron Man ends up on the ship, and they all have to fight for their lives in a sort of battle royale situation. Now, obviously, Team Iron Man plus Jean are successful in taking them out, and so Team Iron Man is beamed out, but Jean is still being held hostage on top of the ship. And of course, this leaves Pepper fairly shaken, and she wants to try and tell Tony that she loves him. Yes, I haven't mentioned it a lot, but slowly the show has been building up to Pepper and Tony getting together, and that's something that's going to be actualized in this two-part special, but is currently going to be interrupted by S.H.I.E.L.D., who is going to try and help form a group, as I'm going to call them the Prototype Avengers, that are hopefully going to help save the day from this Makluan invasion. This team consists of Black Widow, Hawkeye, Hulk, War Machine, Rescue, Iron Man, Nick Fury, and, of course, King T'Challa, one of my favorite characters in this show. Oddly enough, no Jean Grey, but hey, not really too surprised. Regardless, that's the Prototype Avengers, as I'm going to call them, that assemble to try and stop the Makluan invasion, and essentially save the day. And while footage of that is probably going to be playing in the background, I once again want to shift the focus a little bit to Jean. He's had to spend the last few hours essentially powerless, watching as somebody ransacks what he would call his own home, and essentially is trying to destroy it. Meanwhile, Iron Man is doing everything in his power to try and save the day, regardless of the outcome. As a matter of fact, Tony was willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, as when they planned to blow up the Makluan people's home base, at least in a spaceship sense of the way, Tony was more than willing to essentially lay down his life and put it on the line to save the day, and I think that resonated with Jean character-wise, as Jean would never have to do something like that, especially not with all the power he has. Now, it is also worth noting that Tony's identity is completely revealed by the end of this episode. It's completely out there, along with the fact that him and Pepper finally get together. This two-part ending felt really cathartic, simply because we got the wrap-ups to each and every character.
Can I just say one thing to you?
You could, but there's something I'd like to say to you first.
Huh. Another diversion, hey? Oh, Tony.
Especially for Gene Khan, as we finally see him step into the role of being a hero and a protector, especially because his storyline has been the most involved throughout the show.
Perhaps I'm not supposed to rule the world. Perhaps I'm supposed to protect it.
So,
Gene had the most to grow as a character on this show, as a majority of the main cast stayed fairly stagnant and really didn't learn much episode to episode, whereas I felt Gene did for a majority of the show. It's why he got a lot more special attention than, say, Rhodey or Pepper, despite me liking Rhodey, Pepper, and Team Iron Man as a whole more. But, as well, this show just ended on a really high note. The second half of the second season of this show was spectacular. It was actually a really good ending to a show and to a season, and it was really nice to see that this show got a proper ending, having a lot of the loose ends, either from season 1 or season 2, being tied up. Even though I was more critical of the first half of this second season, it's simply because the second half of it is at such a higher standard than the rest of the show, even including the first season. It was just far superior, and that's why I was so heavily scrutinizing the first half of this season, because it just felt bland in comparison, and it honestly just felt like a bunch of filler. Now, 4 months ago, when I decided to post this first talking about, Iron Man Armored Adventures, it was kind of my beginning of laying down a new format on my channel, in which I'll most likely be covering 4 separate shows at once. And I chose this one because I figured I could cover at least one half of the season each month, knowing it would be the first show I ever completely talk about on my channel. And man, has it been one hell of a journey over the last 4 months talking about this show in particular. Getting to go back and watch it as someone who grew up watching this before school every morning, whether it was on a streaming service or I remember watching the finale on TV back when it first aired when I was even younger. This show has always had a special place in my heart and has meant a lot to me as a person outside of just being a content creator. And so that's why I continue to talk about the show, even if I didn't have a lot of character analysis to do. It was also a way for me as a creator to try and spread my wings and see if a more retrospective type format would work, especially for some shows that simply just don't need character analysis, and rather just need to be remembered as fun things to watch. Regardless, I'm rambling once again, so I just want to take a moment to thank you all so much for watching. You guys are absolutely amazing. The support I receive on every single video is spectacular, and I just want to say I truly appreciate that. Once again, I just want to take a moment to thank everybody for watching. If you like the video, please leave a like. It helps out the channel a lot. If you want to subscribe, it's free. You can always unsubscribe later. As well, if you dislike the video, please leave a dislike and then leave a comment down below telling me why. Constructive criticism helps me to make these videos a whole lot better than if I just don't get any at all. And finally, I do have a Patreon in which you can see each one of these videos early, completely unedited, so no freeze frames, no bleeps, no anything like that. And as well, you'll get access to my Discord in which you can speak to me on a far more personal level and get to understand me better as a creator. Not to mention, you just be helping support me. As well, my Patreon is only $1 a month and will be linked down below in the description. And if you can't support me, that's perfectly fine. Now, I do also shout out each one of my patrons in the $5 tier and above at the end of each one of my videos, so it's about time we do that. So shout out to Transgers1, shout out to Video Gamer 75, shout out to Golden Boy 420, Dakota Rawson, Donovan Gomez, and MC Bomb 27. You guys are the goats, and I hope you all have an absolutely fantastic day.